My papers. Good morning, Nolan, Bitcoiner. Another episode of The Breakup, a show where we sort of follow the money, if you will. We follow the money that really is the engine behind the economy. So this show is really about the US dollar, its place in the world, what it's doing, the world it's creating, the world it's perpetuating. And I want to contrast that every time with what Bitcoin can do and some of the problems it can solve. So we usually end every episode with a bit of the Bitcoin fixes this. But the point of the show is to contrast the fiat standard based on the US dollar with the Bitcoin standard and the type of economy, global economy, you can get out of that. Today's story, really interesting. Tim Cook, Tim Apple, as the former president once called him, Tim Apple. So Tim Apple is getting in shit today on the internet because it's been discovered by a magazine called The Information. It was behind a paywall, but I found out how to read it. A little bit about a deal that Tim Cook signed in 2016 in China. And it looks bad. I guess a lot of people are commenting on it today. They're saying, "Oh, I guess here's the resume from The Guardian." What they ended up saying is that Cook lobbied Chinese officials who believed the company was not contributing enough, who believed the company was not contributing enough to the local economy, right? So Tim Cook did some stuff. They wanted to in place restrictions. It was on iCloud, really. It was on iCloud, right? So they wanted the data to be housed there and a few other pieces. And Apple did not want to share access to iCloud with the CCP. Good, right? That sounds like they're promoting the individual. And I use iCloud, and anyone who has an Apple phone uses iCloud. It's pretty important that no one has access. And Tim wanted to fight for that. So he went over to China in 2016. A few things ended up happening. They say you got to invest in the local economy. You got to build these R&D hubs. He built one in Shenzhen. He built one in Shanghai. Totally about sort of saving face of the cities. There had to be a certain amount so that it can be promoted. And then $1 billion investment into like an Uber of China or something like that. So it was all this kind of stuff. But the point in the end was that Tim Cook wanted to preserve privacy around the hardware and how iCloud interacts with it. His bet in the end was that if he sided with Inner Mongolia and some of these subnational states, that he would be able to continue to preserve what he needed for iCloud so that the CCP couldn't infiltrate it, which in his mind would just kill the iPhone. He wouldn't be able to sell it. If it didn't adhere to what the Chinese party standards wanted, he would have been in big trouble. So I'd say there's a lot of fake news out there today about Tim Cook and the deal itself, right? What exactly went into the deal? Because if you look in the deal in the end, he is fighting for more privacy management on the part of the individual phone user versus the CCP. So let's not forget that part, right? It is important. I don't want to throw any crazy aspersions just for the sake of it, right? Because this show is kind of, a little bit obsessed with fake news production. And I always want to admit when fake news is on either side of a debate, right? So it's very convenient for me. It's sort of a perfect argument that Tim Cook just sold out and got a bunch of stuff and sold out to China. That's the story you're hearing, that Tim Cook sold out to China, did all this stuff for sweetheart deals. Sort of true. But the important part is that he was out there trying to preserve an individual iPhone user's privacy, even in China versus the CCP. So let's just make sure that is clear, right? I don't want to make it sound otherwise. So everything's all right, right? He's a hero. He's your friend, right? He's here to help. Wrong. Even if he was here to help you, there are numerous problems. And they start with this idea that corporations, within this context of globalization, have really learned how to play the game with governments. They've learned how to use regulations. They've learned how to use barriers to limit the ability of competitors to gain an edge. So in this case, of course, Apple wants more users. They want more customers, and shutting down the Chinese market is no good. So in this case, they really are preferring overall customers to a customer who has his needs restricted or her needs restricted. What ends up happening though is they don't really prefer US customers and their needs, right? So in this case, they really are trying to help China in ways that are materially beneficial to the CCP. So I want nothing more than the best for Chinese people, but the CCP is a real problem. So at a certain point, you've got to weigh, who you're helping here. And if there are times when Chinese people aren't going to be helped because it would help the CCP too much, you gotta ask the question. You got to make a decision. So I guess they did. So I don't want to mind read what happened on their end. They made a decision, figured it was maybe beneficial for all global users if they just did a bit of stuff with the Chinese CCP. So the problem, though, is that this deal was signed 5 years ago, right? So the deal was signed 5 years ago. And already the economy, up until that point, the global economy, heavily influenced by US dollar hegemony, right? So it was the Pax Americana. There really wasn't, even 5 years ago, another superpower in the world. It was America alone, right? Now, after COVID, some amazing things are starting to happen in the global economy. For example, about 55% of GDP in America as of 2020 is produced by the government, right? So we had a real whittling down of our private sector involvement in the economy just because of the reality of the lockdowns. But what that does is 55% of GDP makes the country and the government's involvement with the country look a lot more like World War II, right? It hasn't seen those levels since World War II, that our economy has been that influenced by a government. And it's the same in China. All of these countries, the governments are playing a much larger role in the economy. So not to say that that is a definition of a world war, but the economies are certainly affected now more than they ever have been by governments. And when certain companies do align to further state objectives, they must be considered state proxies, right? So we can have a look right now on what's happening in America with Twitter. You've got all kinds of purges going on in the past few days, even really tied to stories that are getting a lot of traction. So we saw the Maxwell, the Ghislaine Maxwell trial get suppressed as far as the Twitter tracking goes. There have been a few other really high-profile Twitter accounts that have been taken down lately. Another would be the liberals of TikTok, right? So liberals of TikTok, which was just a site that looked at things people said on TikTok and then put it on Twitter. Curated for sure, but it was no comment added. It was nothing like that. It was just a curated selection of TikTok, videos framed under ridiculous ideas that hadn't really been thought through, right? So that was basically the model, and so anyone who is sort of furthering these state objectives, right, has sort of learned to collude, and you can even see how that plays out if you take a look at the Wall Street Journal today. Eric Schmidt, the former head of Google, who abdicated a ton of R&D control abilities to understand Google during the past 20 years while he was CEO of Google, did a lot to allow the CCP to learn from Google. So there was the Dragonfly project that was a way for them to use Google in China. And then it was banned, of course. And then everything they learned, the CCP learned, looks like it was implemented in the country. So you've got Eric Schmidt, who allowed that to happen. That was like on his on his watch, arguing today, writing an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal saying it's just a matter of time before China takes over. It's inevitable that they're going to pull ahead in AI and a few other fields. So you've got Eric Schmidt doing what Tim Cook could probably do in a couple of years. Say, I was there to help some phone, to keep your phone private and to keep your iCloud account away from the CCP. But, it's inevitable that they're going to get it anyway. And there's not much you can do about it. So that's sort of what we saw Eric Schmidt do today, right? Why is Tim Cook so different? The issue then becomes that these companies that have learned to collude with government to silence their enemies, right, and use regulation as a political weapon, are more and more dangerous. And the reason is this: The reason is this. It's really my prediction for how World War III, we're already in it, and how it can play out, right? So this is sort of a simplified version, but in World War One, right, we can really just see nations versus nations. It was the simple theme of the war, right? It was nations versus nations. You had Germany, you had France, you had England. These armies had been built up for decades at that point, and the fight seemed inevitable. A lot of people predicted it was going to come, and you had a lot of um, um, tension ramped up in the years preceding World War One. But it certainly was the largest clear fight between nations and nations, right? World War II, a little different, right? A little different. America enters the war in a much more meaningful way. And the advantage that America has is that industry is certainly on the side of the United States, as well as the Nazis, right? But it wasn't just purely industry versus industry. The Nazis were able to turn a war machine on and create tools of war at a scale that we hadn't understood yet on Earth, much more than World War One, because the means of production had been so industrialized by then. Um, and America, of course, copied that and was even much better at it. So while the Germans were able to, shock our sense of scale when it came to industrial armament, um, America made that look silly. I mean, just completely out of all scope and proportion as far as what the U.S. industrial base was able to produce to win World War II. So in the end, World War II is a separation, really. It's not just nations versus nations, right? And systems versus systems. In the end, it was the nation plus their industrial base fighting each other, right? And Japan was a great example of that. The countries that did very well had these incredible industrial bases, and the countries, when they inevitably lost, Germany lost because the industrial base was wiped out through war, and America did not have such a loss, right? The industrial base was unaffected on the continent of North America, so it was fine. Um, but now, so America wins World War II and sets up the sort of Pax Americana, right, where there really is only one country. All the other countries in the world are either, going to be communist, but then that ends. So the whole thing is really just an extension of the U.S. dollar. And while countries can choose their own systems, as long as you were part of this global trade movement, which in the end almost all countries became part of, you benefited from the internet, you benefited from all technological innovation that came out of industry. So industry went global, wasn't just restricted to America. So not America alone enjoyed the spoils of World War II. The whole world enjoyed them. In fact, it's a sort of a simple heuristic that I have, that although as a country America won World War II, Americans lost, right? So the country won, Americans lost from this simple logic, right? Every other country in the world got what it always wanted through America winning World War II. That is, Germany got access to global markets and didn't need a navy or an army to do it. Japan got access to global markets, didn't need a navy or an army to do it. China got access to global markets, didn't need a navy or army to do it. America protected all the shipping lanes, gave them everything they wanted. It was as if they would have won, right? And you see by the wealth individuals were able to accrue in their lifetime after America helped rebuild their country, or in the case of China, helped bring it into the world into the globalized economy. Um, you get these people in these countries that did very well. Look at Germans, healthy, strong, great looking. Japan, same, strong, healthy, all these things. America, right, didn't turn out that great. The country turned out great. Americans, after World War II, obesity now, I think it's at 80%. 80% of American males are fat, right? That doesn't sound like you won a war, or maybe it does. I guess it can do that to you, right? There was a certain privilege that came with winning the war, and privilege of printing the dollar. But I'd say, globally, if you want to laugh at a group of people, it's very easy to laugh at Americans. If I'm with Europeans or Chinese people or Japanese people or Koreans, haha, look at those Americans, so dumb, so fat, right? Even Americans can laugh at Americans, right? I mean, everyone can laugh at the people in their own country, but I would say that globally, Americans are kind of looked at as a joke, right? Because of the health aspect. hard to, it's true. Of course, America, that opinion that Americans are a joke, I find ridiculous. It's a huge country, 330 million people, all kinds of different people in that mix. So you can't really generalize, but the rest of the world does. In case you Americans didn't know that, the rest of the world does generalize, think you're stupid and fat, right? I don't know what to say. I get to be like I'm a clandestine American as a Canadian, right? People abroad will tell me bad things about Americans, and they think, oh, it doesn't apply to you. And then, in America, most people think I'm American, so it just gets away with it. But here's the thing: so nations, right, and their industry are the two things that fight in World War II. But now in World War III, right, which some people can say we're already in. We're already in World War III. What do we see, right? My prediction is it's not a replay of nations and industry versus nations and industry. It's subnations and industry versus nations and industry. And we already see it in Apple's technique, right? Apple's technique is very important here. How did they get away with the iCloud piece, right? How did they get away with it? Well, what they ended up doing was they got China to agree to let Apple be quasi-regulated by their sub-states, right? So Apple executives agreed to partner with Chinese companies in Guizhou and Inner Mongolia, locations where they believed Apple will have more influence with local authorities. Apple hoped the authorities could then lobby central government officials to accept compromises to the arrangements, according to internal documents. The strategy apparently worked. Apple, rather than its Chinese partners, controls the hardware security modules that store customer encryption keys required to unlock iCloud content in China. Right. So once again, looks like it's on your side. They used a sub-national state in order to get policy passed, and that's helpful for them, right? So in this case, we can't say that Tim Cook is fully on the side of the nations, right, and pushing for them. In this World War III category, Tim Cook still has a chance, and is still along the lines of playing for, the side of the individual versus the nation. Because here's what ends up happening, right? We already see that in America, as we enter this sort of World War II state with 55% of GDP controlled by the government in the United States, you start to see, and if you even take a look at, China, right? Well, okay, Apple helped China. Well, America is the federal government, right? So innocent. Or can we expect things to play out similar to what we're seeing in China, right? Well, these days, it's kind of hard not to predict that America is falling down the road of censorship, destroying businesses, disappearing citizens off the internet, things that are very similar to what we see in China already. And as a result, it's more and more important for Americans to stand up to these power-hungry moves, to stand up to these tyrannical governments that would do these kinds of things. And, in the case of industry and subnations, we already see it playing out in the Bitcoin world, right? We've got subnational states, Texas, in the case of Miami. So it's not the whole state, but a city. The state itself, Florida, looks pretty positive towards Bitcoin. You see that sort of playing out all across sub-federal states in particular in America, embracing Bitcoin because it could be good for them, embracing sort of more individual liberties, embracing their own sovereignty as a sub-federal state, right? They're as sovereign as a federal entity, so they're exercising that sovereignty. So these subnations and industry here, especially if World War III is not so much a hot war and is much more of an economic or information war, which is where we see ourselves now in COVID, right? Lots of economic warfare, lots of information warfare going on. Things that subnations and industry itself can level up and compete with a nation, bilaterally when it comes to persuasion and these different types of things. So in this case, we've got subnations, industry that could team up. And of course, in that world, the silver bullet is Bitcoin, because industry can be perpetuated by policies if policies can sort of perpetuate the money, right? So if policy has direct effect on the money supply, and that money supply can then be used to prop up industries in order to help a war effort, as we've seen before, right? As we've seen as a great blueprint, it actually works. Then the only way to compete is for Bitcoin to fulfill its role as a new measurement of economic output, which would drain some of the utility of policy-based money creation, right? That would take away the magic wand and force industry to compete on an equal footing with private interests and interests that sort of line up on this side. So, you know, because we are in a period where Americans, and not just Americans, people around the world are going to have to sort of stand up and draw a line in the sand, I guess, in the end, right? That you can't have it both ways. You can't be Eric Schmidt anymore, right? You can't be Eric Schmidt and say, oh, well, we're going to do business in China, no big deal. And then a few years later say, China's going to win everything, give up, right? Tim Cook basically has to party with the Bitcoiners and the small states. He's got a decision to make now, right? Because that deal was made 5 or 6 years ago. And how does it look, right? How does it look that 5 or 6 years ago you helped a country, not the people, you helped a political system be very well positioned today, right? They don't need Apple there anymore, it sounds like. If Apple goes away tomorrow, it sounds like they can copy most of the stuff and compete, and they already have, right? So in this case, World War III heavily dependent on industry having a much larger role in shaping opinion, in winning this information warfare, and of course in helping subnational states win the economic game. Because the only way Texas and Florida are going to win this is if everyone goes there and gets rich, right? That's going to be the appealing thing. So it's important for us to work in the subfederal states that are continuing to embrace individual liberties and just the individual himself or herself, right? That's the important thing. All right, that's all I got for today. Ciao.